I'm Chris Burris, and I am the co-chair of the ZSR Library Lecture Series. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to our first lecture of the 2012-2013 academic year. And we are opening our lecture series this year with Langston Hughes, the People's Poet. We have several selections of Langston Hughes' work on the table to my left that are courtesy of our special collections department. So please come take a look at these books once the lecture is concluded today. And I'd like to say a few words about our speaker and of the Delta Arts Center, where she serves as the executive director. The Delta Arts Center promotes community interest and pride in African American arts and humanities, with an emphasis on the contributions of African Americans. It was founded in 1972 by the Winston-Salem alumni chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and houses a permanent collection of Haitian paintings from the Hewitt Collection, and offers programs for people of all ages in the areas of visual arts, music, literature, drama, history, and folk arts. Now, Dianne Caesar herself has earned her bachelor's degree in history from Spelman College and a master's degree in education from Atlanta University. In addition to serving as the executive director of the Delta Arts Center, she has served as a board member of the Diggs Gallery, a board member of the North Carolina Arts Council, also Renolda House, and several other arts foundations here within the state. Dianne was also responsible for the Artists in Schools program at the DC Arts Commission and for about 10 years she's produced off-Broadway performances. She's traveled extensively in Africa and the West Indies with her late husband, actor Adolph Caesar. Dianne has also worked with the North Carolina Black Theater Festival and the Piedmont Crafts Fair. Dianne has also said that community outreach means the cultural diversity of blurring, including the idea of offering wall space to artists that would not necessarily show at our space. So Dianne is also a proponent of diversity and inclusion in the Winston-Salem community. And one more note, Dianne is also featured in the book Jewels, 50 Phenomenal Black Women Over 50, which is also part of our special collections. And the book is also here on the table as well. So without further ado, Ms. Dianne Caesar.
Thank you, Chris. I didn't know all of those things about myself. I should add, I have now been to Asia. I was in Japan. I was in Asia, and I was in Japan this spring for the first time. So, a dream deferred, a dream fulfilled. Langston Hughes' dream was to be the first African American who made his living through writing. And just to let you see that he did fulfill this dream, at his death in 1967, he had published 16 poetry collections, 14 novels and short stories, 7 nonfiction books, 12 plays, and 8 works for children, which I think is a pretty good bibliography. Like Walt Whitman, Vachel Lindsay, and Carl Sandburg, Langston Hughes was a poet of the people, and the key to his simple poetry is how profound it is simple. In a period when other poets were turning inward, writing obscure poetry to decreasing audiences, Hughes was turning outward, using language, familiar ideas for anyone who could read. Hughes' biographers, Faith Berry, Langston Hughes, Before and Beyond Harlem, and the 2 volumes by Arnold Rampersad, The Life of Langston Hughes, have not ignored the fact that Hughes was one of the most controversial names in the history of American poetry. To readers who love verse and are also committed to the ideas of political justice, he was most eloquent. For still others, he is above all the author of poems that are often touching with their lyrics and beauty beyond the issues of race and justice. Still other readers, and for many critics, Hughes' work was far too simple, too commercial, and too radical in politics. But Hughes succeeded in his lifetime aim to create a body of work that epitomized the beauty and variety of the African American experience, as well as the diverse emotions, thoughts, and dreams that he saw as common with all human beings. Langston Hughes was born in 1902 in Joplin, Missouri. His father, James Hughes, was a lawyer and a striver who detested the way Negroes were treated. He also detested other black people. James Hughes removed himself to Cuba and then to Mexico, separated from his family in 1907. Hughes' mother, on the other hand, was very middle class, an aspiring actress, and a wanderer. But she instilled in her son the love of theater and books. She made a small living giving recitations in churches and halls. And Hughes recalls his worst spanking came after her audience laughed during one of her most dramatic performances, but he was mugging in the background. And she had never forgave him for it. From the age of 5 to 12, he lived with his grandmother, Mary Patterson Larry Hughes. Mary's first husband was killed during the raid on John Brown on Harper's Ferry. She was brought back the shawl that he was wearing when he was shot, that she kept with her throughout her life, and would wrap Langston in at night and tell him the stories of Harper's Ferry, of John Brown, of the Kansas-Missouri fights, and instilled in him a great pride, but a great fear of failing. Mary was also the sister-in-law of John Mercer Langston, who was an abolitionist and who was one of the first elected black officials in this country. He also served in Haiti. So the 7 years that he spent in Lawrence, Kansas with his grandmother impressed upon him a great deal. He started school in Lawrence, Kansas, but this was the first time he was introduced to prejudice, both from the teachers and his fellow students. So he retreated to books. Among his favorites were Huckleberry Finn, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Zane Grey's cowboy fiction, the Bible, and The Souls of Black Folks by W.E.B. Du Bois. He was very lonely with his grandmother. His grandmother was not a very expressive woman, and she was always with money problems, which will follow him for the rest of his life. But they did have family friends called the Reeds who took him in following her death until his mother could come and retrieve him. And he had great experience with them, and one of the most lasting impressions at that time, Mrs. Reed was very religious and spent much of her time on her knees and at church. And during the summer of his 12th birthday, there was a great revival. And all of the young people in the community came up to be saved. They received the Spirit and they came up to be saved. At the last night, Langston had not received the Spirit and felt he would disappoint his aunt if he did not go to the pulpit. So he did, but it had always bothered him that it wasn't a true experience. And he cried that night more from the fact that he had lied to Mrs. Reed, and more than the fact that he felt that he had not been worthy and the Spirit did not come to him. So maybe it wasn't his fault, maybe it was the Spirit's fault for not recognizing him. And this bothered him for the rest of his life. At the beginning, after the 8th grade, he moved with his mother and her second husband to Lincoln, Illinois. He was recognized for his intelligence there, and he was elected class poet. Although he later joked that the election was the result of his teachers stressed on rhythm in poetry. And everyone knew except him that all Negroes had rhythm. And this aside was very much like Langston Hughes. Langston found humor as a way of deflecting discrimination, work that he didn't get. So all through his life, he will find these little asides that he used to explain and diminish any insults he may have had. The family then moved, and this family moved a lot. This family moved to Cleveland, and he entered Central High School. Central High School at that time, in the 1910s, was a utopia for young students. It had a great mixture of European immigrants, of local Jewish people, and he thrived there. He was part of the French club, which he continued to speak French. He was editor of the newspaper, and he was also class poet. During this time, he had very little contact with his father. His father had set up businesses and farms in Mexico and was very well-to-do. The father had come to the United States during this senior year, which, by the way, Langston was left in Cleveland by himself as the family moved on to another place. So he lived in a rooming house from the time he was 15 until he finished college, till he finished high school. His father had made some effort to get in touch with him and invited him to come to live in Mexico with him. He saw this as a way of getting his college tuition paid for. So he agreed to go to Mexico following his graduation from high school. He was a disappointment to his father, and his father was a disappointment to him. His father was very materialistic, very much a businessman, very much a capitalist. And he put Langston to work doing bookkeeping, at which he was terrible. And the summer was a strain on both of them. And finally, after many arguments, it was decided that the father, James, would pay for his tuition to Columbia, but he had to study engineering. And even at this point, Langston was determined that he would be a writer. But not being a foolish man, he accepted this and went to Columbia University, studying engineer, but taking a lot of English and poetry classes. This was 1919, 1920, and he ran headlong into the Harlem Renaissance. This was a period of time during which Black people were encouraged to be part of the arts, to write, it was the feeling of the NAACP that by showing that we had culture, that we'd be accepted by the mainstream. It was also the time of Du Bois's palliative 10th, that those black folks that were educated, that were artists, had the responsibility of bringing the other 90% along. And so he ran into many of the artists. He ran into Du Bois, he ran into Johnson, Aaron Douglas, and all of this exciting milieu. And of course, after 1 year, quit Columbia. But in 1922, he had his first poem written, and the poem is one of everyone's favorites. It was written in 1918 on his way to Mexico as he passed over the Mississippi. And the poem is The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I have known rivers. I have known rivers as ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut in the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans. I have seen it muddy, bosom turn all gold in the sunlight. I have known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. During this time, he became friends with one of his best friends was Colin, another poet of this time, but a much more formal poet than Langston. He took part in many activities, including Colin's wedding to W.E.B.D. Du Bois's daughter. They were married, and then the poet left with his best friend Jackman on the honeymoon, leaving the daughter at home. Popular but broke, Langston decided that he wanted to see the world, and he hopped a freightliner to see the world, but he ended up at Jones Point on the Hudson in the frozen winter. So there he spent a season reading and meditating, doing some writing, and flirting with Alan Locke. I will talk more about Alan Locke later. In the spring, he found a ship sailing to Africa, and he signed on as a mess boy. And after sailing the West Coast, loading and unloading cargo, fights, near mutiny, and visiting poorhouses, he jumped ship in Rotterdam. He then made his way to Paris. In Paris, he washed dishes in Maman at brick tops, and he courted a young woman named Anna Maria Corsi. He traveled to Italy with his mentor and later tormentor, Alan Locke, where Dr. Locke tried to seduce him. From Paris, he continued to submit work to Crisis magazine, and returning to New York, he moved to Washington, D.C. with his mother, who was now in D.C., living with some richer relatives. He continued to write, and during his 14 months in Washington, he published more poems than he had ever done. He was working as a busboy at the Willard Hotel, and he ran into a well-known poet, and he slipped him his portfolio. And the poet was quite impressed with this work, and asked could he publish it, and also published a story about the busboy poet. Langston Hughes. And this was one of his official welcoming his introductions to the world of poetry. In 1923, the crisis magazine of the NAACP, Opportunity magazine, posted a competition to poets and the young artists, and Langston Hughes won the first prize for a poem called The Weary Blues. It was one of his first blues poems. It's a very long poem, and it's easily found if you ever want to read it. It was during this time, doing this competition, that he met Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston is herself one of the members of the Harlem Renaissance, but she was unlike everybody else. She was a Southerner. She came from a black town. She told tall tales. She was the third prize winner, and she was in New York to begin her education. And she was very interested in becoming an anthropologist. But Zora had more nerve and veer than anyone in this group. For example, she had a job where she went around Harlem asking to measure people's heads because of the belief that you could tell intelligence by this. And she would just walk up to people and say, "Can I measure your head?" And they said, "Yeah, Zora, measure my head." He also met at this time the photographer Carl Van Vechen, who would be his supporter and his mentor all through his life. Unfortunately, he asked to be introduced to Zora Neale Hurston, and they did become very fast friends and agreed immediately to work together, to collaborate together, which was not a great thing. At that same time, he was also accepted at Lincoln University. Lincoln University is a historically black college in Pennsylvania that has produced, it was a male school at that time, and very well thought of. And Langston was accepted at Lincoln and spent 3 very happy years there. He had to borrow his tuition from Amy Spingard, who was a wife of the president of the NAACP, Arthur Spingard. This is another friendship that will last his lifetime or their lifetimes. He entered in 1926. These were very productive years. He made many tours. He wrote many essays. Made many friends, became an Omega, which is a black fraternity. And Alan Locke introduced him to a woman named Charlotte Mason. Charlotte Mason is known throughout this story as Godmother. She was a very rich widow living on Park Avenue who had a great interest in natural people. She thought Indians and black folks were natural. And she was very taken with both Zora Neale Hurston, who lied to her through her teeth, and Langston Hughes, who felt that she was the grandmother that he never had. But she paid for his tuition. She supported him and Zora. She sent Zora on expeditions down through the South to collect folklore, but she held on to it. They could only write what she suggested they write. And at that time, Langston was writing a novel not without laughter. She didn't quite approve of it, so it began to cause some fusion between the two of them. But he continued to work, and she supported him for 9 years until a fallout that was precipitated by Zora Neale. And here's what happened. After he finished college, godmother put he and Zora and Louise Henderson together in New Jersey to write at a black boarding house. And they came up with the idea of writing a play called Mulebone, based on Zora's Tall Tales. It was about a murder with the jaw of a mule. Langston was writing the book, and they were getting along fine until Zora got jealous of Louise. And she began telling tales about what they were doing and to whom they were doing it to godmother. So Langston left, Zora went on her way, and the play was just left. 29, and godmother cast him out. He was very unhappy and almost had a breakdown. So 29 and 30 were not good years for him. In 31, broke, he retreated to Cleveland. His mother was now back in Cleveland. And he was taken in by the Caribou House, which was one of the leading black arts groups in the country. It was started as kind of a settlement house in Cleveland, but it grew to be a theater and a play group, and it still exists. Well, when he got there, he learned that they were about to produce a play called Mulebone by Zora Neale Hurston. No name, no anything. He recognized the script, and he wondered why his name wasn't on it. He contacted Zora and asked what was going on. She swore to high heaven, and you have to remember, she's very dramatic. She fell on the floor, she cried, she said, nobody loved me. This was her play. Yes, he did do something, but the idea was her, the story was hers, this was her play, and that she was not going to put his name on it. The play did not see the light of day until it was staged at Lincoln Center in 1980. But that really ended his relationship with godmother and his relationship with Zora Neale Hurston. They did not speak for 30 years until Zora got into a little trouble in New York. She was accused of seducing a young boy and was put in jail. And of course, she called on Langston to be a witness to her character. Langston was not unbusy. He published 2 books and appeared in numerous poetry magazines, completed the play Cross, later to be entitled Mulatto. And upset over this brouhaha, he left the country on an extended tour to Cuba, Jamaica, and Haiti, where he met many artistic friends who he would continue to champion throughout his career, influencing and transforming their work. And in 1931, returning from this trip to the Caribbean, he began his long career as a lecturer. When he returned from the Caribbean, he found his car with flat tires, no money as usual, hocked his camera, and managed to get to Daytona Beach, Florida, where he was taken into Bethune-Cookman by Mary McLeod Bethune, another wonderful black leader at that time who started school, North Carolinian, by the way. At his suggestion and with her backing, he received a $1,000 Rosenwald grant And Hughes made a 3-month tour of the South, reciting his poetry and selling his books. The University of North Carolina was the only white college where he had a firm booking, but it caused quite consternation throughout Chapel Hill and the state, and it opened his eyes to the suffering of Southern blacks, especially the prominent Scottsboro trial. During this time, this is during the Depression, during this time, 4 young men were pulled off a train in Alabama accused of rape and thrown in jail. And Langston Hughes and many others came to their defense and started a fund. And he did very much to get them released, which they never were. This is also the time of his strongest radical work. He was writing for magazines like the New Masses and the Daily Worker, and it had a very socialistic tinge to it. He was also working with his friend Arna Bontemps, who was teaching at a Seventh-day Divinity School, 7 days Advent school in Alabama. And this is when he started working on his series of books and also the play St. Louis Woman, which was taken from Bontemps' book, And God Sends Sunday. At the end of his tour, he ended in California, and he received an invitation to join a film crew. This was a group of 22, some actors, some insurance salesmen, some singers, one dancer, with Louise Henderson, who was a socialist. She had been invited to create a group of blacks to come to Russia to make a film about how blacks were depicted in the United States. So they sailed to Russia to make this film. 22 of them, strangers, most of them, and got to Russia and found out they had a German director who didn't speak English. The script was not written. This was Langston's job. And so after great difficulties, the Russians said, we aren't ready, so they sent the crew off to tour Russia and to the Black Sea, and the group kind of fell apart at that point, with the real socialists against the people who wanted to go back to the United States. The group fell apart, but Langston stayed in Russia for a year. He had a brief romance with a dancer named Sylvia Chin, who was an African Chinese woman from Trinidad. I mention this because the women I mentioned will come back in his life at another time. He did an intensive tour of the USSR, going to many of the countries that had become part of it and were going through a communist revitalization. He even met people from Tuskegee Institute who had come over to work with the farmers. So there was and he had great sympathy for the U.S., for Russia and the collectives that were starting in these stands, Izika Stand and all of those. Under that influence, he wrote a poem called Goodbye Christ, where he questions the fact that God could really be there and treat black folks like he treats them, that he could treat poor people like he treats them. And this upset many, many religious leaders, particularly in the South. And while he never gave permission for the poem to be published. It was published in Russia and made its way back to the United States. He toured through this area of the U.S. For a year, ending up in Korea and in Japan, where he was questioned by the Japanese police for being a socialist. He returns to California and to the welcoming hospitality of who would become his best friend, Noel Sullivan. Noel Sullivan was a grandson of a rich San Francisco banker, at one time a socialist, a devout Catholic, and a great integrationist. And this became Langston's second home. He did much of his writing there. He visited it every time he could. And it was so much his home that Sullivan built a cottage for him on his farm. And this is where he wrote magazine articles and the ways of white folks. He was also at this time involved with the John Reed Society and ended up getting run out of Carmel Valley because of these red leanings as they were seen. He returned to New York in 1936 and resumed his love-hate relationship with the theater, and the production of Mulattoes was mounted. This is the story of a young mixed-race girl, ends very sadly, and this is one of the points that Langston always went back to, that of mixed race, of the tragic mulatto. But the play was not the problem, it was the producer. Although Langston was very much involved in the play, his problem was that the seating was to be segregated and the treatment of the author and the cast by the producer. The play went on for many, many productions, and there was always a fight. It was taken to arbitration. He didn't get his royalties. The royalties came when the producer wanted to. And as a result of this, being back, he wrote one of his famous poems, "Let America Be America Again." Let America be America. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain, seeking a home where he himself is free. Let America be the dream dreamers dream. Let it be the great, strong land of love, where neither kings connive or tyrants scream, that any man be crushed by the above. That's just one of the many verses of it, but it was his cry. And it ends, "Oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." Through all of this, anyone who describes Langston Hughes will describe him as a smiling, easygoing, fun-loving. Everybody talks about his laugh, that he could laugh at adversity, that he was a great friend, he was a great companion, he was a great dinner guest, and that they never saw him lose his temper, they never saw him angry with anyone. He would fight for his rights, but it was just he had lawyers. Now that's one thing, he had lawyers, and he would let them do the fighting. He would smile in the face of his opponent and write the lawyer and say, "Go after him." And he is very lucky that he had great lawyers who did do this. He also wrote a comic play called Little Ham that was produced at the Caribou House at this time. He was elected as an officer in the International Writers Association, which was again a socialist group that represented writers all over the world. He spoke at their conventions twice, in 1937, and in 1937 he was hired by Afro-American newspapers to cover the Spanish Civil War. And there he met Hemingway and many of the other writers. He wrote about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and the many black men who had left the United States to fight in that war. He returned home, as always needing money, and he hit the lecture circuit again. But this time he was met with protests because of the poem that he had written. And so many of his engagements were canceled. People either said, we can't take this trouble, or we don't want you here. He was even picketed by Amy McPherson, because he mentioned her in this poem. He decided that he needed his own theater, and he started a group called the Suitcase Theatre, and they produced Don't You Want to Be Free, which was a composition of his poetry, and it introduced Robert Earl, who was James Earl Jones' father. He left again to go to the leftist International Writers Association. And at this time, he was less radical, and he began talking about the power of language rather than the power of race. But he, even in his sojourns in the United States, the things that bothered him most were the lack of accommodations, the way he was treated, not as a man, but as a boy. And as a result of that, he wrote an essay. He was also becoming famous as an essayist. And he wrote an essay entitled, What the Negro Wants. And they are equal education opportunities all over America, decent housing, full participation in the government, a fair deal before the law, public courtesy, and social equality in service. For all of his radical beliefs, he worked very diligently during the Second World War for the government as a publicist. He also wrote a play called The Sun Do Move, which had to do with things that he thought he would never see, that when the Army was integrated, when there were certain decisions to integrate the workforce and Army plants and things like that. He thought that we're seeing a new day, and he wrote this play called The Sun Do Move. He also created a very popular character called Simple. His name was Jesse B. Simple, but everybody called him Simple. And for 25 years, this column appeared in the Chicago Defender, which was the oldest black paper. And Jesse B. Simple was bar stool philosopher. And he and his interrogator would talk about everything under the sun, from the war to integration, why people. One of his favorites was he always thought that he should have an ugly woman because nobody would want her before him. But Jesse B. Simple became Langston's alter ego. And all of the things that he was too nice and too smiling to say, Jesse B. Simple said them for him. This column ended in the after his death. At the time of his death, it was published in the New York Post. And it was great, a great source of income for him through the years. He never made a lot of money. I think $30,000 was the most he ever made, and it bothered him because, as I said, his dream was to be a professional writer who lived by his writing. In the 50s was the worst time for Langston Hughes. He was called before the Committee on American Activities by McCarthy. He, for many years, the FBI had been keeping a folder on him, and he was accused of belonging to 98 socialist or communist groups. He never was a communist, he never was a card-carrying communist, but he did belong to these groups, and the files showed that he did. Lord Garrison's grandson defended him, and he told on no one. He did not take the Fifth Amendment, but he did admit to writing these poems. Again, the poem came up again. There was a poem he wrote, what the S in USA means. After the hearings, he thought he was vindicated. He was terribly afraid of going to jail, but his bookings fell off, and again he fell into poverty again. And again, he had to claw his way back up. He made his money translating poems. He was a linguist. He spoke French, he spoke Spanish, he spoke some German. And many of the young poets that he had met in the West Indies and Europe were sending their work to him to translate. He also wrote his second autobiography during this time, The Big C. I'm sorry, I Wonder While I Wonder was the second one. Late in the 50s and early in the 60s, his career was revived. He was invited to the White House, which was one of the happiest days of his life. He was invited to meet one of the African presidents. He was invited to another luncheon for poets. He was accepted into many societies. He was given the Spingarn Medal for which he had won it for many, many, many years. And then in 1966, President Johnson appointed him to lead the delegation of Americans to the first World Festival of Negro Arts, where he was hailed as a historic figure in black literature. His American dream to earn his living solely from his writings from public lectures owed acceptance to the love from the average Negro who placed Langston Hughes at the pinnacle of literary reverence, and to them he was their poet laureate. His poems have been translated into German, French, and Yiddish, and many have been set to music. His cantatas and poems are still recited 40 years after his death in 1967. One of my favorite sayings is, as I said, he was a witty man, and one of his favorite sayings, "Oh, it's such a bore to be poor, to be always poor." And I don't think that had to do with him and never having enough money that he thought he should. An artist must be free to choose what he does, certainly, but he must also never be afraid to do what he might choose. And then his favorite about things that drove him crazy. Looks like what drives me crazy has no effect on you, but I'm going to keep at it till it drives you crazy too. Okay. So that ends my talk on Langston Hughes. I know a lot more, so if you have any questions, I could probably find a story to go with your question. Yes, Robert?
Did he know Richard Wright by any chance? Had they ever had contact?
Yes, he had been in Chicago when Richard Wright introduced his book, and Langston Hughes helped many writers, including Wright and Allison. In fact, he visited with Wright a day before he died in Paris.
The reason I ask is he wrote a book. Richard Wright wrote a small book that it was called White Man Listen, and when I read that book, I kept thinking of the ways of white folks, and I was wondering if he had talked to Langston Hughes or any evidence he had
They
talked to him
had
about
talked. They were friends. Langston Hughes thought Biggers was not the example of a black man that you would want to set before the public. He thought he was too black. And Langston Hughes always wanted to elevate the community and elevate the race. And he was more interested in that middle class striving race of black people, perhaps something he got from his father. But he was disturbed about that, and he was a little jealous too. Yes?
Did he talk more about his father or his mother in his autobiography? Did they ever respect him as a writer, or did they consider him a career?
The mother wanted him to support her, and so she was supportive when he was making money, but she could be very demanding when he wasn't. He ended up in Beyond the Sea. He says he hated his father. He truly hated his father. And as he was always looking for mothers or guardians in women all through his life, he cared little for either of them. Yes?
Even so, do you think that his father had any influence on his writing career?
I think his father had influence on him because he was always worried about money, and if he was earning money, he was proving to his father that he could do what he wanted to and earn a living. His father did read some of his poems and was familiar with them, but he made very few comments on them. When he was notified after coming back from Russia that his father had died, it took him 6 months to get to Mexico. Yes, Robert?
What was done? You made some allusions to about some relationships with men too. Was he bisexual, or was he, in terms of the sexuality, just sort of curious about that?
Everyone who is quoted says he was asexual. That he did have these two affairs, I guess you would call them, these two romances with these two women, one who thought he was going to ask her to marry him and come to the United States, Chin. But he also, in his later years, had a great deal of secretaries and bookkeepers, and he adopted a young African. But no one ever claims that he made advances to them. So it seems to be the conclusion that he was asexual, that he just did away with that part of his life. Yes, ma'am?
What is his influence today?
Where is his influence today? I'm not sure.
Are his works all in print?
Many of his works have been reissued. I think the last composition of his work was put out in 1996. So his work is around, and you can go to the internet and find most of his poems fairly easy. And I know at one time many of his books were available.
I wondered whether he's taught now in schools. I grew up with his being in our literature textbooks in high school. I wonder if that's true today.
I really don't know. I really don't know. Some of you younger people, did you come across Langston Hughes in your
Yeah. I
in your textbooks?
just from my English teacher in high school.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was taught and referenced a lot, especially in regards to jazz music and sort of making a link between his writing style and jazz music in my high school.
Yes?
I'm curious about your interest in Langston Hughes and your research. How do you do your research, or have you seen his personal papers or documents? Or is it through his writings?
I'm not swearing by this. I think I heard Langston Hughes read at Winston-Salem State or A&T in the early 50s. So I think that's where I first knew the name of it. My husband did a one-man show of poetry, and Langston Hughes was included in it. And I guess there are 6 ways of separation. I knew Arnold Rapistad and other people who are mentioned in the book. So I guess I went to books for my research, and the books that I own of his.